Historically, the geographical and political uses of the word Britain have not neatly overlapped. According to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC, there were two large Britannic islands, Albion and Iona, in the ocean at the northwestern edge of Europe's trade routes. The Romans used the word Britannia to refer to the part of the larger of the two islands that they ruled as a province of their wider empire for nearly 400 years. At times, Roman Britain included parts of modern-day Scotland up to the Firth, but it never extended over the whole landmass, nor across the waters to Ireland. With the retreat of Roman power, and the subsequent waves of invaders and migrants that followed, other national identifications came to the fore and were to play a major role in state formation in the centuries that followed. For the Anglo-Saxon historian Bede, writing in the 8th century, Britannia was a purely geographical term, referring to the island itself. The British were a distinct people with their own language, whose ancestors predated the Roman occupation, but they now inhabited only the west of the island, having been displaced by other groups. Perhaps because of the Roman legacy, perhaps because its boundaries were so ambiguous, the word Britain seemed to attract imperial ambitions. In Wales, annalists of the 10th and 11th centuries, looking for grandiose titles to give their rulers, spoke of them as head and glory of all the Britons. Anglo-Saxon kings too, when they had any political ambition, were apt to designate themselves as kings of all the British, even though their writ did not run further than the limits of their own tribal kingdoms. Both Edward I and later Henry VIII drew on mythic visions of a Britain united under a single ancient ruler to legitimate their claims to overlordship of the whole island. And it was under Henry's rule that Wales was formally brought into England's administrative orbit. But ideas of Britain were not simply expressions of an unsatisfied English imperialism. Political unification could also be championed by those north of the Anglo-Scottish border. While some Scots in the 16th century saw English invasion as a vehicle for religious reformation, others on the defensive against English claims saw a genuine union of equals as an alternative to English domination of the whole island. For the 16th century Scottish historian John Mair, a common British interest, the common good of all those who inhabited the island of Great Britain, transcended the particular, conflicting and tragically misunderstood interests of the separate Scottish and English kingdoms. The fortuitous union of crowns in 1603, an accident of hereditary succession, seemed to confirm to many that Providence had preordained the union of the two by now Protestant kingdoms. The new monarch, James VI of Scotland and First of England, self-consciously styled himself as King of Great Britain, and the royal and merchant ships were instructed to fly the new British flag. But James' vision of a perfect union of laws and belief to accompany the new union of crowns, founded on the resistance of his English subjects, fearful of the king's real motives. For a brief period, amidst the great and bloody upheavals of the 17th century, there was a single polity in the British archipelago. England, Scotland and Ireland were ruled via London as a single Cromwellian Commonwealth, an arrangement that was to end with the restoration of the monarch in 1660. It wasn't until the beginning of the 18th century that a lasting political union was to be achieved, and with it, the creation of a new British state.
I don't think any historical development or circumstance is inevitable, but you can say that the Treaty of Union of 1707, a lot had anticipated it. So there had been that union of crowns through the 17th century. There'd also been growing connections between England and Scotland in trade, in mobility, and in forms of Protestantism. And in fact, many Scots of the political elite had been pressuring for a closer union still in the late 17th century. And it had been the Westminster Parliament that had been resistant. But what really makes a Treaty of Union in 1707 inevitable in the short term is the pressure of war with France and the problem of the succession. The feeling that unless the whole island of Great Britain is tied up in one system, you may get a Roman Catholic Stuart monarch trying to come back when childless Queen Anne finally dies.
The two kingdoms each had autonomous successions. The fact that they shared the same monarch was as yet merely a dynastic happenstance. So when the dynasty died out, Scotland could technically choose an entirely different dynasty to succeed Queen Anne and the Protestant line of Stuarts. The net result is that the Scots indeed deliberately passed legislation through their parliament saying that unless they could reach accommodations in their relationship with England, particularly with regard to trade, then Scotland's incoming new dynasty after Queen Anne's death would have to be different than that taken on in England.
What concentrated minds after 1702 was that England and Wales, alongside of Scotland, were again at war with France. A breakdown in Anglo-Scottish relations, the possible restoration of a pro-French monarch north of the border, might tip the scales in France's favour. They might become, as many contemporaries feared, powerful enough to dominate the entire European continent. From the English perspective, political union was seen very much as a way to eliminate the potential threat posed by the action of an independent Scots Parliament, which could, if it wished, choose to destabilise relations between the two countries. The achievement of a political union that incorporated Scottish members within a Westminster Parliament headed off this possibility and would preserve English security. But if this objective was to be achieved, it first had to be approved by a majority in the Scots Parliament. English politicians and Scots supporters of the Union hammered away at the threat of a Catholic restoration and the danger it would pose to Scots Protestantism. The proposed terms of the Union guaranteed a separate Scottish Church within the boundaries of the old Scotland and helped to placate much hardline Presbyterian opinion. But there were also those who hoped that their voting for union would bring material gain, some for wider patriotic reasons, others for more self-interested ones.
Scotland was felt to be, by many in Scotland, in a dire economic situation, which could only be remedied by free access to the English Empire. They busily traded illegally with that English Empire, but they had no formal legal right of access. There was a kind of hope that since England had a burgeoning, for the time, relatively modern economy, that Scotland would be kind of lifted on an English tide economically. And the final reason it passes is manipulation. The Scots administration, with considerable financial help from England, and by dint of some very good political footwork on their part, is able to twist arms, persuade, cajole, charm a lot of Scottish politicians into backing their project of union. One should never detract from the genuine sincerity of many Scots Unionists. They genuinely believed in what they were doing. Others were out for the main chance.
The Treaty of Union remains profoundly controversial and politicised, and people tend to stress different aspects of it according to their nationalist or political perspectives. It's important to remember it was controversial at the time, and people were divided about it at the time on both sides of the border. It's controversial in England in part because it is a deal. By the Treaty of Union, the Scots lose their Edinburgh Parliament and are given a quota of seats in the House of Commons and the House of Lords in Westminster. But they keep a lot. They keep their educational system, they keep their ecclesiastical organisation, they keep their Scots law, of course, but they are given access to the commercial goodies. They can trade much more easily across the border, and they get access to a burgeoning British Empire on much more preferential terms. And some English politicians, and particularly, of course, some English merchants, really don't like this. They feel that the Scots are getting too much in the deal and England isn't getting enough. Now, of course, on the other side of the border, there is controversy too. Some Scots don't like the loss of their ancient independence. They have, to put it mildly, ambivalent feelings about England in some cases. And there are elements of bribery involved in 1707, just as there's elements of bribery going to be involved in the Act of Union with Ireland in 1800, 1801. Bribery, I should say, was fairly common in 17th, 18th century politics generally, so this is not that unusual.
The idea of equal partnership within a British Union was absolutely essential to the Scottish perception of what it represented. The arrangement of the new British state was supposedly one of equality between the two former kingdoms. Technically, England ceased to exist in 1707 as well. But the reality was an English ascendancy. Scottish representation at Westminster was less than that of Cornwall. The result was that when something was seen as a national issue by English MPs, they easily overbore a Scottish opposition. Scots found out the hard way, in the first 10 years after the Union, that they were very junior partners and would get what they hoped for only when it did not inconvenience English interests.
Historians and political scientists differ in what they think a nation is. Some people view a sense of nationhood as something organic, something waiting to be discovered, something that is very much bound up with ethnic and cultural distinctiveness. Other scholars tend to put much more emphasis on issues of fabrication, invention, active creation. So it isn't as if nations are always there waiting to be discovered. People make political decisions or come together due to particular pressures and help to forge a nation. And I use forge in all sorts of senses, obviously. There were senses of, very strong senses of Scottish identity, Welsh identity, and perhaps most of all English identity already by 1706, 1707. But these senses of identity were complicated by other forms of loyalty, loyalty to region. There are big divisions between attitudes in the Scottish Lowlands and the Scottish Highlands. Cornwall, still at the beginning of the 18th century, has people living in it who can only speak Cornish. The great bulk of the Welsh people speak only Welsh. On the other hand, North and South Wales are still very much divided in terms of communications. So the Treaty of Union of 1707 creates a unified parliament. It creates in name a unified British state. But there is a lot of work, a lot of time needed to mesh this into something more than a political arrangement.